The sky turned dark over Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. Within hours, a massive tornado tore through 3 states, wiping out towns and taking nearly 700 lives. It was the deadliest tornado America has ever seen, and the scariest part, experts say it could happen again. March 18, 1925. Noon approached across the rural heartland of America. Farmers worked in their fields, children filled classrooms, shopkeepers stacked shelves. The day felt strangely warm for March, the air heavy, the sky dim and restless. Few noticed the subtle shift in the wind, the quiet drop in pressure, the eerie calm that spread across southeastern Missouri. No warnings would come. In 1925, weather forecasting was primitive and tornado prediction was unheard of. Radios existed in homes, but not with real-time storm alerts. The towns and farms of Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana had no idea that within hours their world would be torn apart. By the time the skies split open, it was already too late. What formed that day was no ordinary storm. It was a monster, a tornado so vast, so relentless, that it carved a 219-mile path of destruction, the longest continuous tornado track in recorded history. Whole towns would vanish. Nearly 700 lives would be lost. Thousands were injured. Families torn apart. This is the story of the tri-state tornado, America's deadliest storm. The tri-state tornado of 1925 did not appear suddenly, out of thin air. Its roots began in the restless dance of air masses across the American continent, an invisible struggle in the skies that no one on the ground could see. The science of meteorology was still primitive, but modern researchers have pieced together what nature was brewing that fateful morning. Spring in the Midwest is a season of contrasts. Warm, moist air surges northward from the Gulf of Mexico, heavy with humidity. At the same time, cold, dry air descends from Canada and the Rockies, slicing across the plains. Where these two forces collide, storms are born. On March 18, 1925, the clash was unusually violent. High above the earth, winds screamed from the southwest, accelerating the spinning updrafts that would become supercells. At the surface, temperatures were unusually mild, creating instability, fuel for something far worse than the average thunderstorm. Meteorologists today would call it a textbook setup: strong shear, deep moisture, and explosive instability. But in 1925, there was no vocabulary for it. The U.S. Weather Bureau, fearing public panic, had even forbidden forecasters from using the word tornado in official bulletins. Communities had no radar, no sirens, no warning systems. They were blind to what was coming. That Wednesday morning dawned deceptively calm. In Missouri's rolling hills, farmers led mules to fields. Housewives hung laundry to dry in the odd March warmth. Children walked to school beneath skies that looked gray but not alarming. Some remembered the stillness. Chickens were restless, dogs barked at nothing. The air grew heavy, almost metallic, as if charged. Farmers noticed clouds flattening into strange anvils far to the west, yet no one thought danger was imminent. By midday, a dark line had formed on the horizon. At approximately 12:30 p.m., storms began to bubble across southern Missouri. The first reports were ordinary: heavy rain, thunder, gusts of wind. But within these storms, rotation was already forming, an invisible spiral of rising air that would soon tighten into a vortex. Eyewitnesses later recalled a sudden drop in temperature, then a stillness so complete it made birds fall silent. Horses refused to move, and people felt pressure in their ears, like being underwater. At 1:00 p.m. near Ellington, Missouri, the storm's fury took shape. The first visible funnel descended from the churning clouds, thick and wide, trailing dust and debris before it even touched the ground. Unlike the thin, rope-like twisters people sometimes saw in the Midwest, this one appeared as a black, rotating wall, so broad that it didn't look like a tornado at all. To witnesses, it was as though the sky itself was falling. One farmer described it as a mountain coming toward us, moving faster than any horse could run. Others thought it looked like the horizon was folding in on itself. When it touched down, it roared with the sound of survivors compared to 1,000 trains. Houses exploded outward as the pressure inside them burst. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Livestock were plucked from fields and carried into the whirling dark. The tri-state tornado had begun its march. Most tornadoes, even strong ones, hopscotch across the landscape, touching down, lifting, reforming. The tri-state tornado was different. Once it formed, it stayed on the ground. For more than 3.5 hours, it carved a nearly unbroken scar through the land, maintaining unimaginable violence mile after mile. Modern studies suggest winds inside the vortex may have exceeded 300 miles per hour, the very upper limits of nature's fury. Its path width ranged from half a mile to a full mile wide, dwarfing entire towns beneath its shadow. The average tornado lasts less than 15 minutes. This one would rage for over 200. In the small community near Annapolis, Missouri, residents saw the black wall approaching and scattered in panic. Some fled for storm cellars. Others tried to outrun it with wagons and horses. Few succeeded. A schoolteacher later recalled grabbing her students and huddling them in a corner. The building trembled before the windows burst inward, shards of glass slicing through the room. The roof lifted as if pulled by an invisible hand, and the walls folded in. Only those shielded by fallen beams survived. A coal miner working outside recalled being blown across a field like a rag in the wind. When he came to, the mine entrance was buried, and the camp around it had disappeared. Scientists today still debate why the tri-state tornado was so unusual. Some argue it was not a single tornado, but a series of violent twisters produced by one monstrous supercell. Yet the damage path 219 miles long shows remarkable continuity. Whether it was one or many, to those in its way, it was unstoppable. The tornado's speed added to the terror. Moving at nearly 60 miles per hour, it outran horses and left no time for escape. Survivors often said they saw it only seconds before it was upon them. By then, there was nowhere to hide. From Ellington to Beale, Missouri, the storm chewed through farms, homes, and entire neighborhoods. Roofs sailed into the air like paper. Heavy beams impaled the ground like spears. Families who had lived in the same place for generations saw their world reduced to splinters in minutes. But Missouri was only the beginning. The monster was strengthening. Each mile, it fed on warm air, growing broader, darker, and deadlier. By the time it crossed the Mississippi River toward Illinois, it was a force unmatched in American history. Narrator. It began as a clash of air masses. It became a black wall of death. And as it left Missouri behind, the tri-state tornado prepared to carve its name into history, town by town, street by street, family by family. The tornado's first victims were small communities like Annapolis and Beale. Wooden homes stood no chance. Families ran for root cellars, but many didn't make it in time. The storm swallowed farms in seconds, ripping barns from their foundations, carrying livestock through the air like leaves. In Ellington, a teacher recalled the schoolhouse shaking before the windows exploded inward. Children screamed as the roof peeled away. Only those who clung to heavy desks or were shielded by fallen beams survived. Further northeast, the tornado struck mining towns. In places like DeSoto and Ledana, miners underground survived, but when they emerged hours later, they found their homes gone, families missing, streets unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods had been erased. The Missouri death toll climbed rapidly, with hundreds injured, but the tornado was only gaining strength. As the tornado crossed the Mississippi River into southern Illinois, it grew deadlier. Here lay larger towns, denser populations, and schools filled with children. The monster storm, already carving a historic path, was about to unleash its greatest fury. Murfreesboro would become synonymous with tragedy. The tornado struck just after 2:30 p.m., when many families were returning home from lunch and children were still in classrooms. The black funnel tore straight into the heart of town. Entire blocks disintegrated in seconds. Brick walls toppled like playing cards, wooden homes burst apart, and businesses crumbled into piles of splintered timber and stone. A school collapsed with children still inside. Survivors remembered the screams of classmates suddenly cut off by falling beams and walls. The destruction didn't end with the wind's fires erupted in the wreckage, fed by broken gas lines and overturned stoves. These flames spread rapidly, trapping people beneath debris. Families clawed at the rubble with bare hands, desperately trying to reach loved ones before fire consumed them. Some succeeded, many did not. Nearly 200 people died in Murfreesboro alone, making it the single deadliest city tornado strike in U.S. history. Those who survived described wandering through streets they could no longer recognize, where homes, shops, and landmarks had stood for generations. Only smoking ruins remained. Just miles away, West Frankfort suffered a nightmare of its own. The tornado roared into town at the worst possible moment, school dismissal time. Hundreds of children were walking home when the black wall descended. Witnesses said the storm seemed to snatch people from the ground, lifting children and adults alike into the air before hurling them into collapsing houses and debris fields. One school collapsed in front of horrified parents who had come to collect their children. Dozens of students were killed instantly, others trapped beneath rubble as parents dug frantically to save them. The tragedy was not contained to schools. The tornado tore through entire neighborhoods, leaving whole families dead, entire blocks gone. In total, West Frankfort lost more than 150 lives. For many in southern Illinois, West Frankfort became a symbol of grief, a town where the innocence of childhood was swallowed by the storm. But the tornado did not spare the countryside. Farming communities stood directly in its path, and with homes spread across open fields, there was little protection. In Gorham, entire families were wiped out within minutes. Survivors described returning from errands to find not just their homes destroyed, but their loved ones missing, never to be seen again. The open fields became graveyards of livestock, where cattle and horses lay strewn among twisted machinery and uprooted trees. Farm equipment that had weighed hundreds of pounds was found mangled and tossed hundreds of yards away. In DeSoto, the storm struck with shocking precision. 69 people were killed, nearly one-third of the town's population at the time. For such a small community, the loss was catastrophic, leaving few families untouched by grief. By the time the tornado left Illinois, the destruction was almost beyond comprehension. More than 600 people lay dead, thousands more injured, and entire communities erased. Families dug graves side by side, churches overflowed with the dead, and hospitals were overwhelmed with the wounded. The tornado had now traveled more than 150 miles without lifting, an almost unimaginable feat. Still, it was not finished. Ahead lay Indiana, and the monster still had strength left to destroy. The tornado crossed the Wabash River into Indiana around 4:30 p.m. Its violence had not diminished. The small town of Griffin was almost completely obliterated. Only a handful of buildings remained standing. In Princeton, the tornado flattened 85% of the town's homes. Survivors described the storm as a freight train that never stopped. One farmer recalled clinging to the roots of a fallen tree as the winds tried to tear him away. When the storm passed, he stood alone, his house, his barn, his family all gone. In Indiana, another 70 people were killed, adding to the staggering toll. Only as dusk approached, nearly 4 hours after first touching down, did the tornado finally dissipate. The statistics remain almost too large to comprehend. 695 dead. Over 2,000 injured. 15,000 homes destroyed. But numbers alone cannot capture the devastation. Behind every figure was a face, a family, a story forever altered by the tri-state tornado. In Murfreesboro, one mother threw herself over her children in the cellar, trying to shield them from the collapsing house above. She lived, but her children were crushed beneath the beams. Neighbors later pulled her away as she clung to their still bodies, refusing to let go. In West Frankfort, miners rushed from underground when the storm passed, only to find their homes flattened. Without hesitation, they began digging through the wreckage of neighbors' houses, using bare hands and broken boards to reach survivors. The men who had spent their lives clawing coal from the earth now clawed for human life. In Indiana, a young boy wandered for hours in shock, clutching the severed hand of his little sister. He didn't realize she was gone. People who saw him tried to comfort him, but his vacant stare showed he was far beyond comfort. Medical facilities were completely unprepared. Hospitals filled within minutes, hallways lined with screaming patients. Doctors and nurses worked until their arms gave out. With electricity cut off, they operated by lantern light, and when morphine ran out, surgeries continued without anesthesia. Amputations, stitches, and splinting were done with whatever tools were available. One doctor recalled hearing the cries of children begging for their mothers, and the silence that followed when the realization came that their parents were gone. Another nurse described the smell of smoke and blood mixing with antiseptic, the sound of saws cutting bone, echoing through the makeshift wards. Churches across Illinois and Indiana became morgues. Wooden pews were lined with the dead, bodies covered by blankets, coats, or bed sheets until relatives could identify them. Sometimes entire families were laid side by side, leaving no one to claim them. In some towns, officials posted names on chalkboards outside buildings, so survivors could search for missing loved ones. Identification was often difficult. Many were disfigured beyond recognition. Rings, watches, or scraps of clothing became the only clues. Gravediggers worked around the clock, digging long trenches when cemeteries could no longer keep pace. For every tragedy, there were also stories of improbable survival. In DeSoto, a baby was found alive beneath a pile of debris, its crib overturned, protecting it from the crushing weight of fallen beams. In Gorham, a man described being thrown nearly a quarter mile, landing in a muddy ditch that softened his fall. He staggered up with broken ribs, but alive. In Murfreesboro, a woman trapped under a collapsed store was dug out 2 days later, dehydrated but still breathing. These miracles became lifelines of hope for communities drowning in grief. They were repeated in newspapers across the nation, proof that life could endure even when everything else had been lost. The toll on children was especially horrific. Schools in Murfreesboro, West Frankfort, and DeSoto were struck while classes were in session. Entire classrooms were buried. Survivors remembered the screams of classmates as roofs caved in and walls collapsed. Teachers acted as human shields, throwing themselves over their students. Some saved lives. Others died beside the children they tried to protect. After the storm, orphaned children were left wandering streets, clutching the hands of strangers, calling for parents who would never come. Relief workers described the heartbreak of trying to comfort them, knowing their families had perished. Physical injuries healed slowly, but the psychological scars often never did. Survivors spoke of recurring nightmares, of phantom winds howling in their ears at night. Many could not stand the sound of thunder again. Some refused to rebuild in the towns where their families had been wiped out, moving away to escape memories. Others rebuilt on the same land, saying they could not abandon the grave of their loved ones. A woman from Indiana recalled, "I lived, but part of me was buried that day. You don't recover from watching your whole family vanish." Funerals stretched for weeks. In Murfreesboro, there were not enough coffins, so bodies were buried in makeshift boxes. Ministers conducted services from sunrise to sunset, sometimes for dozens of victims at a time. Despite the scale of loss, survivors leaned on one another. Neighbors shared food, strangers took in orphaned children, and towns across the Midwest sent supplies. The Red Cross coordinated relief, but it was the people themselves who did the heaviest lifting, clearing rubble, burying the dead, feeding the homeless, and consoling the broken. Walking through the storm's path was like stepping into another world. Survivors described silence, broken only by the cries of the wounded or the moans of livestock trapped beneath barns. Debris was everywhere, furniture tangled in trees, wagons wrapped around telephone poles, entire houses reduced to splinters. Personal belongings scattered the fields, family Bibles, torn photographs, wedding dresses, toys, all lying in the mud. These fragments of ordinary life became symbols of what had been lost. The statistics will always remain: 695 dead, thousands injured. But the true toll was measured in empty chairs at dinner tables, in the silence of classrooms without children, in churches missing entire congregations. Behind every number was a name. Behind every statistic, a story. The tri-state tornado was not just a natural disaster, it was a human tragedy of unfathomable scale. The tornado's winds were not the only killers. When the storm roared through towns, it ripped open gas mains, toppled lanterns, and scattered wood stoves. Fires ignited instantly. What had been a wall of wind became a furnace. In Murfreesboro, Illinois, the destruction was compounded by fire. The storm had reduced blocks to heaps of splintered wood, but within minutes, those heaps ignited. Flames leapt from house to house, fueled by broken gas lines and spilled oil lamps. Survivors, dazed and bleeding, suddenly found themselves surrounded by fire. Some tried to dig loved ones out before the flames reached them. Families clawed at the rubble with shovels, then with bare hands, splinters cutting their skin, fingernails torn. Mothers screamed the names of children. Men lifted beams with impossible strength, but the fire spread too fast. Many survivors were forced to make the most terrible choice: flee and live, or stay and die beside the trapped. One witness later recalled, "The tornado took everything. The fire took what little was left." The fire was merciless. It turned collapsed neighborhoods into open-air crematoriums. Even those who had survived the storm were swallowed by smoke and flame. In some places, entire blocks burned for days, leaving nothing but ash and scorched earth. The stench of charred wood and burned flesh hung heavy over the towns, impossible to escape. For rescue workers, the fire was an enemy as deadly as the tornado itself. Teams that rushed in with axes and wagons had to turn back. The heat was unbearable. In Murfreesboro, one Red Cross volunteer said, "We could hear voices under the rubble, but we could not reach them. The fire kept us away. Their cries stayed with me forever." The destruction left law enforcement overwhelmed. Police stations themselves had been flattened, officers killed or injured. Communication lines were down, telegraph wires snapped, roads blocked by fallen trees and wreckage. News of the disaster spread slowly, and help arrived too late for many. Into that vacuum came desperation. Survivors, hungry and homeless, searched through ruins for food and water. Others looked for valuables, taking what they could from collapsed stores and broken homes. Looting became a grim reality. People who had lost everything turned on one another. Arguments erupted in the streets over supplies. In some towns, local officials imposed martial law. Soldiers were called in to restore order, patrolling streets with rifles. Curfews were set. Looters, when caught, were publicly shamed or beaten. The chaos revealed how fragile the fabric of the community became under the disaster's weight. For those who had nothing left, the nights after the storm were the worst. Survivors camped in open fields, huddled together for warmth under blankets salvaged from ruins. Others slept in tents hastily erected by the Red Cross or in railway cars brought to shelter families. Children whimpered in the dark, terrified that the storm might return. Every gust of wind, every rumble of distant thunder sent panic through the camps. One man later said, "We did not sleep. We watched the sky. We were sure it was coming back. Those without shelter slept under the stars, exposed to cold spring nights. With food scarce, many went hungry. Relief supplies trickled in slowly, arriving by train or wagon, but not nearly enough to feed the thousands suddenly homeless. In the first days, searching for survivors consumed everyone. Families refused to give up hope. Fathers dug with bare hands, ignoring bleeding knuckles, lifting shattered beams alone until their bodies collapsed. Mothers moved rubble stone by stone, calling the names of children buried below. Some were found alive hours or even days later, pulled from pockets of air beneath collapsed buildings. These rescues sparked brief moments of hope amid despair. Crowds cheered, tears streamed, prayers were shouted to the heavens, but more often, the digging revealed only bodies. For every child found alive, dozens were recovered lifeless. Each discovery was followed by fresh grief, new funerals, longer lists of names written in chalk on boards outside churches. Survivors often spoke of the smell, the sharp tang of smoke, the sickening odor of decay as days passed and bodies still trapped beneath ruins began to rot. In the spring warmth, the stench carried through towns, impossible to ignore. Masks of cloth soaked in vinegar or whiskey were used by rescuers, but nothing could fully block it. One Red Cross nurse later described the moment she realized she was standing beside a collapsed home that held an entire family beneath it. The smell alone told the story. As days turned to weeks, another fear gripped the survivors: disease. With clean water scarce, sewage systems destroyed, and bodies decomposing in the open air, cholera and typhoid threatened. Relief workers worked quickly to bury the dead, sometimes in mass grave when coffins ran out. Doctors issued warnings, urging communities to burn debris and disinfect wells. The thought that illness might sweep through what little remained of the population terrified people as much as the tornado had. In many towns, disease was only narrowly avoided through sheer determination and hard work. Amid all this chaos, there were acts of extraordinary humanity. Neighbors who had lost their own families took in orphans. Strangers shared what little food they had. Farmers who still had barns standing opened them to house dozens of homeless families. Churches, even when damaged, became hubs of aid, distributing supplies and organizing searches. One priest in West Frankfurt refused to leave his ruined church. Instead, he lit candles among the rubble, calling it a light for the lost. Survivors gathered there at night to pray, cry, or simply sit together in silence. Beyond physical destruction, the storm shredded people's sense of security. Survivors spoke of living in constant dread. Children refused to enter buildings again, terrified roofs would collapse. Adults confessed that every dark cloud, every distant rumble of thunder, sent them running for cover. The tornado had not just broken buildings, it had broken nerves, trust, and the illusion of safety in everyday life. The days after March 18 looked like a battlefield. Whole towns had been reduced to heaps of rubble, and the silence was broken only by the cries of the injured and the hammers of rescue workers. Railroads became lifelines. Trains rolled in carrying doctors, nurses, caskets, and food. Red Cross teams set up tents where neighborhoods once stood, and the first semblances of order began to take shape. But for many survivors, the road to recovery would stretch into years or never truly come at all. Photographs from the days after the tornado show nothing but splinters and ash where vibrant towns once thrived. Churches that had stood for decades were reduced to foundations. Schools lay in heaps of brick and timber. Families walked through streets unable to recognize their own neighborhoods. It wasn't just homes that had been destroyed. Businesses, factories, and farms, the very backbone of local economies, were gone. Machinery lay twisted in fields. Rail lines were ripped apart. Telephone poles snapped like matchsticks. For small-town America in 1925, there was no insurance payout, no government agency to rebuild. Reconstruction depended on grit, charity, and time. The American Red Cross became the leading force in recovery. Workers poured in from across the nation, distributing blankets, food, and medicine. Tents were erected in straight rows, serving as temporary housing for families who had lost everything. Nurses set up makeshift hospitals in schools that were still standing, treating broken bones, burns, and deep lacerations. Children orphaned by the storm were taken in by relief stations until foster arrangements could be made. The Red Cross also provided burial services. Coffins were in short supply, and in some places, bodies had to be placed in simple wooden boxes or wrapped in cloth. Volunteers, many grieving their own families, dug grave and stood beside ministers as town after town held mass funerals. But the burden did not fall solely on national relief. Communities came together in remarkable ways. In Murfreesboro, carpenters salvaged lumber from wreckage to rebuild shelters. In West Frankfort, miners whose own homes were destroyed labored day and night to rescue others and later to construct temporary housing. Farmers from nearby counties donated wagons of grain, meat, and milk. Churches in unaffected towns opened their doors to refugees. Strangers took in orphaned children, raising them as their own. One story tells of a woman in Illinois who, though she had lost her husband and children, spent her days cooking meals for other survivors in a relief tent. Her grief, she said, was unbearable, but helping others gave her a reason to keep going. News of the tri-state tornado spread across the country through newspapers and radio broadcasts. Headlines called it the storm of the century and printed lists of the dead. Donations poured in from as far away as New York and California. Schoolchildren sent coins. Churches raised collections. Businesses sent rail cars of supplies. The tragedy shocked the nation not only because of the staggering death toll, but because of its scale. Few Americans had ever imagined a tornado that could travel nearly 220 miles, obliterating everything in its path. Economically, the tri-state tornado caused damage estimated at $16.5 million in 1925 dollars, equivalent to more than $250 million today. But the figures barely scratch the surface. Factories that provided livelihoods for thousands were gone. Farms that had fed entire counties were reduced to bare soil. Thousands were unemployed overnight, their tools and workplaces destroyed. For many families, rebuilding was not an option. With no savings, no land left, and no relatives to turn to, they left. Populations of some towns never recovered, the storm altering demographics for generations. Behind the statistics were wounds that never healed. Survivors spoke of the deafening silence in the weeks after, the absence of laughter, of church bells, of normalcy. Streets once filled with children were empty. Communities felt hollow, as if part of their soul had been ripped away. Children who lost parents were raised by grandparents, aunts, or even neighbors. Some were separated from siblings, placed in different homes. The storm didn't just take lives, it scattered families across the Midwest. A farmer from Indiana later recalled, "It wasn't just the barns and fields we lost, it was the way life had been. We never got it back." Mental scars lingered as much as physical ones. Survivors described living in fear every spring, watching the skies with dread. Some refused to sleep indoors, haunted by the memory of collapsing roofs. Children cried at the sound of wind, certain another storm was coming. There was no name then for post-traumatic stress, but it was etched into every face. Ministers counseled grieving families, doctors treated nervous ailments, but for many, time was the only medicine, and time was cruel. Slowly, brick by brick, some communities began to rise again. Murfreesboro rebuilt schools and businesses, though scars remained visible for decades. West Frankfort constructed new homes, determined to carry on despite its losses. In smaller towns like Gorham and DeSoto, rebuilding was far harder. With populations decimated, some places never fully recovered. Ghostly foundations remained as silent markers of what had been. Still, there was resilience. Families rebuilt on the same plots where their homes had stood, planting new gardens, erecting new barns. They honored the memory of the lost not by leaving, but by continuing life where it had been interrupted. In the wake of the storm, conversations about weather safety grew louder. While the the Weather Bureau had long resisted issuing tornado warnings, believing they would incite panic, the tri-state disaster proved the cost of silence. It would take decades, but eventually the culture shifted. By the 1950s, tornado watches and warnings became standard, saving countless lives. The legacy of the tri-state tornado was not only in destruction, but in transformation. It revealed the vulnerability of rural America, the strength of community bonds, and the urgent need for scientific progress in forecasting. The tri-state tornado remains, nearly a century later, the deadliest tornado in U.S. history. Its devastation was so complete, its statistics so staggering, that it has never been forgotten in meteorological science or in the memories of the communities it scarred. 695 dead, more than 2,000 injured, 15,000 homes destroyed, a 219-mile continuous track. Those numbers place the tri-state tornado not only at the top of America's tornado tragedies, but among the deadliest weather disasters of any kind in the nation's history. Hurricanes, floods, and fires have killed more people in single events, but no tornado has come close. Other famous outbreaks, like the super outbreak of 1974 or the Joplin tornado of 2011, were catastrophic, yet even those pale in comparison to March 18, 1925. The tri-state tornado holds a record so grim it may never be broken. Modern research suggests the tornado would today be rated an EF5, the highest category on the enhanced Fujita scale, with winds likely exceeding 300 miles per hour. The sheer size of the vortex, up to a mile wide, and its relentless speed, around 60 miles per hour, gave it killing power unmatched in history. Meteorologists long debated whether the tri-state tornado was truly one continuous funnel or a family of tornadoes produced by the same supercell. Most tornadoes lift, dissipate, and reform, leaving gaps in their tracks. But the evidence here points to something almost unbelievable: a single, continuous monster that stayed on the ground for more than 3.5 hours. To this day, no other tornado has come close to matching that endurance. The legacy of the tornado is not just scientific, it is human. Survivors who lived to tell their stories carried memories that never faded. In Murfreesboro, families passed down accounts of parents shielding children, of fires that consumed the rubble, of nights spent in fields under the open sky. In West Frankfort, stories of schoolchildren taken by the storm became part of community history, retold in hushed voices at family gatherings. For many, the tornado became a line in time, life before and life after. Town histories, gravestones, and memorials all bear silent witness. Even generations later, the name tri-state tornado could silence a room. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the tri-state tornado was the transformation of weather forecasting in America. In 1925, the U.S. Weather Bureau had strict policies forbidding the use of the word tornado in forecasts. Officials feared that warnings would incite panic and hysteria. Communities were left blind, with no alerts until the storm was literally overhead. The death toll of the tri-state tornado proved the cost of silence. While change was slow, tornado prediction remained controversial for decades. The seeds were planted. By the 1950s, meteorologists began issuing watches and warnings, and communities started installing sirens. Today, Doppler radar, storm chasers, and trained spotters provide precious minutes of warning, often enough to save thousands of lives. Every siren that wails in the Midwest carries an echo of 1925, a reminder of why warnings matter. In recent years, researchers have revisited the tri-state tornado with modern tools. Using reanalyzed weather maps, computer models, and eyewitness reports, they've pieced together a clearer picture of the conditions that spawned the monster. The setup was extraordinary: warm, moist air surging north from the Gulf, clashing with powerful cold fronts sweeping from the Rockies, all under the influence of a strong jet stream. The result was a supercell of unimaginable strength. Some scientists suggest the tri-state tornado may not have been unique, but the product of conditions that, while rare, could align again. That possibility is perhaps the storm's most unsettling legacy. The tri-state tornado also revealed the vulnerability of small-town America in the early 20th century. Most homes were wooden and poorly anchored. Schools lacked basements or reinforced walls. Fire safety was minimal. Hospitals were small, understaffed, and under-equipped. The tornado didn't just expose weaknesses in nature's face, it exposed weaknesses in society. Communities learned that survival required preparation, stronger buildings, and better communication. In towns across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana, memorials stand today for the victims of 1925. In Murfreesboro, a stone monument lists the names of those lost. In West Frankfort, cemeteries hold rows of graves with the same date carved into them. Families still tell the stories. Schoolchildren still hear the accounts during history lessons. The tri-state tornado became more than a storm. It became folklore, a tale of loss, resilience, and survival passed through generations. When the Joplin, Missouri, tornado struck in 2011, killing 161 people, many called it the deadliest in modern memory. Yet even that horrific tragedy was only a fraction of the tri-state tornado's toll. Why the difference? Better forecasting, faster communication, stronger buildings, and widespread public awareness. The tri-state tornado forced America to change, and those changes have saved countless lives since. Had a storm of similar magnitude struck in 2011, experts believe the death toll would have been dramatically lower, though still devastating. The lessons of 1925 live in every warning system, every storm drill, every siren that blares across the plains. Perhaps the most haunting question: could another tri-state tornado strike today? Meteorologists say yes. The conditions that created the 1925 storm, though rare, are not impossible. Climate change adds another layer of uncertainty, potentially altering storm patterns in ways scientists are only beginning to understand. If such a storm formed today, Doppler radar and warning systems might save thousands. But with modern towns and cities far larger than in 1925, the economic damage could reach billions. The risk remains real, and the memory of the tri-state tornado serves as a warning. The storm's legacy is not only in science or memory, but in the resilience it inspired. Communities rebuilt, families carried on. The Midwest endured, stronger for its suffering. The tri-state tornado taught America that nature's fury cannot always be predicted, but preparation, unity, and remembrance can lessen the toll.